The market smelled of coffee, frying oil, and the green, dry dust that rose from the road each time a truck rode past. Under the tamarind tree, cloths hung like flags. Indigo, ochre, the faded blue of a shawl kept folded against the seamstress's ribs. People moved in easy orbits. A woman bargaining for plantains, a boy threading beads, an old man blowing tobacco smoke into the bright morning. It was a small town in 2025 where everyone knew which houses had new tin roofs and which families had gone 2 winters without a doctor's visit. It was the sort of place where promises were currency and a smile could become a contract. Maurice's truck arrived like thunder softened by lacquer. He stepped down in a shirt that caught the light, his grip on the truck's chromed handle a small, deliberate demonstration of return. A businessman home from the city, a promise of jobs and a factory the color of new coin. Men straightened, women held their purses. He moved through the stalls with pledges and pamphlets, leaving a trail of quick laughter and polite, measured compliments. He had the sort of voice that made the tamarind leaves hush. Sarian was at a stall that belonged to her mother, Rosa. Faded sewing patterns pinned to a line, bolts of cotton leaning like small flags. Her hands smelled of starch and thread. She had a steady economy of gestures, the precise tuck of a hem, the way she rolled a spool back onto its peg. She had learned to measure things not only by length, but by the temperature of a room. A quick intake of air could tell her if someone was being honest. When Maurice's hand closed briefly on her wrist, an attempt to redirect her attention, he said, a claim he would later insist of familiarity, the town held its breath. The touch was small, the consequence enormous. It was the kind of contact that fixed itself in the evasive geometry of memory. A fingertip pressed too long, a palm that would not read the line between friendliness and ownership. Sam, who taught the children in the back room of the school and who had walked Sarian home more afternoons than anyone could count, saw the way her jaw tightened. He stepped between them as he had stepped between street fights and breaking arguments for years. He did it with a teacher's hands, firm, unclenched, the kind of intervention meant to steady, not to inflame. "What do you think you're doing?" Sam asked, voice low as if he were keeping the town's thin peace. Maurice laughed it off, his hand retreating as if it had been a misstep. "Old friends," he said, and the words were already a currency he expected to spend. Around them, murmurs turned into questions. A crowd congealed under the tamarind's dappled shade, and what began as gossip bent quickly toward accusation. An informal hearing formed before the day had promised anything official. People took sides as they always did, by need, by history, by the small debts and favors that tacked the town together. The market's 8 exchanges under the tree read like a quick altar, voices passing the question back and forth until someone had to hold the answer. Laya: "He's offering work. Who would turn that down?" Leela: "Work for scraps if it costs a woman her safety?" Grandpa Heron: "Oh, my child, you expect a man with money not to have enemies." Mira: "I've known Maurice since he was a boy. This isn't like him." Rosa: "My daughter's hands stitch more than clothes. They stitch our family's roof. She keeps herself. She said no." Sam: "She said no. That matters." Maurice: "You're making a mountain of a pebble. I touched her wrist, nothing more. There's charity to be done here." Pastor James: "We must listen. We must be careful." 8 exchanges, 8 small verdicts hanging in the thin air. The tamarind's leaves knitted a private roof above them. The crowd dispersed with new edges. Some went home to count potential wages, others to whisper in kitchens that would swell with rumor. What was public in the market, the grip, the look, the man who had returned with a truck, immediately began to have private consequences. After the market, Sarian folded a blue scarf, a scarf with a burnt edge she kept for reasons she rarely explained. The scarf's singe was like a shrine.
It belonged to a memory that had tunneled into her in the years after her father left, and the roof leaked and the hospital bills piled up. She did not speak about the night her mother had wrapped that scarf around a child's head and smoothed the singed fringe away as if it could press down a flame. There were 3 particular memories she wore like stitches: the night of a child's betrayal, the day a door was slammed and never reopened, the slow lessons in calculating each room's danger. When Sarian let herself visit those rooms, she did so with a seamstress's exactness, naming the threads and the weak joins. The first of those long private paragraphs sat at the base of everything she would do now: a childhood built on half-truths and a mother's fierce keeping. She was 6 when the fire came. It was small at first, fat drops of oil igniting in the kitchen, the sort of accident everyone in the town later called tragic misfortune to soften the edge of it. She remembers a blue shawl, its edge already fraying, wrapped around her thin shoulders. The house smelled like burning oil and wet cotton. She could feel the heat like a new language on her cheek. A man, someone who should have been a neighbor, someone who had once promised to marry her mother and never did, left the gate swinging. The neighborhood closed faster than the door. Sympathy was a passing thing. Rosa, furious and precise, stitched and soothed at once, turning the burned edge inward as if that would hide what had been lost. From then on, Sarian folded feelings into the hems of clothes, kept the singe inside. She learned how to make a life that would not depend on promises.
The second paragraph became the quiet ledger of betrayals. A father who chose the city over the child's future. A brief and sudden vendor's loan that became an unpayable debt. Laughter that ended when the lights went out. There are things that leave marks you can't sew over. The particular gust of wind that sends a roof tile spinning. The small, shameful counting of coins to buy rice. Sarian's heart measured affection in the weight of currency and in the steady, small returns of honest work. She kept a list of what was owed to her and never let it out into the open. The third paragraph was the slow lesson of watching men offer grand gestures while their hands practiced other economies. She learned, at 13, that compliments could be invoices disguised as prayers. At 20, she learned to leave a margin in every transaction, a space for a sudden storm. There were times she wanted to trust. She wanted a room where someone could stay awake to tell her if it rained. But she had built walls gently, brick by brick, hem by hem. When Maurice's palm closed for a second on her wrist at the market, it landed not just on skin, but on every margin she had ever carved. The decision to file a complaint was not spontaneous. It was a ledger, a list of what was endured, what was witnessed, and who could bear witness. With Sam's help, 3 witnesses affixed their names with shaky hands. Laya and Leela promised to testify about the market's rhythms. Grandpa Heron and Mira swore they had seen Maurice swagger like a man used to standing in rooms with papers and signatures. They went to the county clerk's office the afternoon the humidity made the town slow. A young clerk stamped the paper with a mechanized, indifferent precision. The filing had the clinical hum of bureaucracy mingled with the thick smell of the tamarind leaves. And for the first time, the grievance acquired numbers. Case 2025 TRM 143. A concise, precise procedural note was read aloud for anyone who needed a timeline. The complaint was filed with the county clerk. The police intake unit has up to 14 days to open and log the report. The respondent must receive notice within 30 days. Preliminary intake and witness interviews are scheduled within 45 days unless extended for shown cause. Those windows were not guarantees of outcome. They were the town's attempt to put time around a hurt. After the papers were signed and the stamp still warm, Sam stood in the doorway of the clerk's office and said, softly enough for only Sarian to hear,
"We won't let this be erased." This line became the hinge for what happened next, an invitation for the town to look squarely at what it valued. It was also the moment Maurice began to mobilize. Maurice's campaign worked in two registers. Publicly, there were dinners, plates heavy with roast and promises, and the kind of sponsorship that makes streetsmen sing.
He promised a small factory on the outskirts of town, jobs for the young men who drifted toward the highway in search of day labor. He underwrote a water pump on the square and gave the school new chalk. He framed his gestures as repair. To some, they looked like salvation. Privately, he sent envelopes and men with gentle words. A scholarship here, a chicken there. His generosity was calibrated to ease the sting of accusation and to make gratitude the dominant narrative. Mayor Ortega kept his office as a theater of calm. Maurice visited in the afternoons when the sun softened, speaking in measured tones about investment and civic pride. The mayor listened with a politician's practiced face, brows doing all the listening a town needed before a decision was made. At one point, in a conversation that smelled of coffee and varnish, the mayor suggested a mediated, non-public meeting, an attempt to wrap the problem in confidentiality. Maurice nodded, his fingers running along the edge of a municipal brochure, like a man who reads the future in paper. Sam organized differently. He used the school as an archive of memory. He encouraged students who had seen small things, shouts, the way a truck idled long in the afternoon, to tell simple, factual accounts. He summoned the quiet courage of neighbors who knew that what they had seen mattered. When LaQuaya and Leela agreed to sign affidavits, their hands shook not from fear alone, but from the sudden gravity of making a public claim. Then the town began to speak in more official tones. An informal tribunal gathered beneath the tamarind, a place where the town had always tried to decide what was shameful and what was salvageable. The tamarind tribunal was no alternative to law. It was a map of the town's moral geography. People named harms and offered remedies. There, Maurice tried to repair in front of the public, a speech about jobs, a promise of an apprenticeship program. Sarian listened, hands folded in her lap, her thumb turning a thread unwinding from a spool. Night fell. The market stalls closed, and the tamarind's shadow pooled like ink across the road. The first act of intimidation came as a slow, methodical vandalism. Sarian's little shop door bore a smear, the paint scraped away in a careful arc, as if someone had wanted to carve a warning rather than break a lock. The scrape waited for her the next morning, like an accusation. The scrape of paint was both symbolic and practical. It said someone could reach what she cared for. It said the town's boundaries were porous. In a compressed, sharp paragraph that felt like a small surgical cut, Sarian ran her hand along the scraped paint, feeling the ridged edge with a seamstress fingers. She thought of how threads fray at the edge. She thought of how one pulled strand could unravel a whole hem. The scrape was a message meant to unsettle, and it did. The men who came the night Maurice's truck rode past argued about whether it was cowardice or strategy. Leela thought it was meant to frighten. Grandpa Heron muttered an old proverb about how fire begins with a single spark. Rosa watched a wound not only in the paint, but in whatever else would be tested next. Sam said nothing for a long, steady moment, and then made a plan to document the damage and to have a neighbor stand watch at night. That plan did not promise safety, it promised witness. There was a private confrontation in the mayor's small office one afternoon that compressed weeks into a handful of heated breaths. Maurice had leaned over the desk as if he and the mayor were negotiating a treaty. Sam slipped in behind them after a school meeting and asked for the courtesy of a conversation. The meeting turned quickly, not into blows, but into a bearing of motives. Maurice's tone softened only when he believed he could win hearts. Sam's voice was a flat blade. He asked for an end to the private envelopes. Maurice smiled like someone who could see a calculated return in any cost. The exchange was brief and razor-sharp, each sentence a stitch meant to bind or to tear. In that narrow moment, with sunlight in the slatted blinds and the town's fate pressed like a seam under their hands, the lines between money and care were drawn in high relief. There was also, beneath the surface, an older memory Sarian carried that visited sometimes in the small private hours like a rain that would not turn away. It was a night when her mother had wept and nobody had come to hold the roof. She saw again the edge of the burned shawl, the exact smell of smoke, the way her mother had tamped the flame as if it were something they could hide in a cupboard. This flash of abandonment had a particular shape. Not a single image, but a small, ongoing arithmetic of neglect. And it remained a place she returned to when the world demanded her courage. The town's informal hearing, meanwhile, escalated when an object, an empty bottle tossed from a crowd, skittered across the dusty ground during a particularly combustible moment. Fingers pointed. Some saw it as accidental, others as targeted. The bottle's arc cut through the afternoon like a punctuation, landing between two people who had stood the closest to the fact of the market. The sound of it was a new kind of punctuation, sharp, public, undeniably a break in the town's stage gentleness. Those three small, tight shocks, the memory that tightened a jaw, the scrape of paint on a nighttime wall, the bottle thrown in broad daylight, were each like a stitch pulling against a seam. They made the town tender where it had once been only indifferent. After the bottle, the informal tribunal could not pretend to be merely a conversation. People arrived in lines now, affidavits multiplied. Maurice's man with the envelopes grew more careful, his face less easy. The mayor convened a public meeting to manage what had become a matter of civic dignity. As the town polarized, practical necessities took over.
Witnesses were asked to sign statements, not as if they were sealing fate, but as if they were leaving breadcrumbs for an institutional path forward. Officer Ellis, a steady presence with a notebook that never seemed empty, explained the next steps in a voice calibrated for clarity. The report would be logged, forensic intake could be requested, witness interviews would be scheduled within 2 weeks. He read the legal windows again for those who needed them in plain language, so nobody could mishear the calendar. Intake, 14 days. Notice to respondent, 30 days. Preliminary interviews and scheduling within 45 days. He was careful to tell them these were administrative windows, not guaranteed outcomes, and that the role of the police was to set the mechanism in motion rather than decide the moral question. Maurice responded as someone for whom influence had long been a meeting place with truth. He organized a public dinner the week after the bottle incident, plates laid under strings of white bulbs, speeches that threaded gratitude with 2 words he used like a charm: progress and opportunity. He made sure his banners carried the school's logo. He brought men who had worked in the city and who now spoke about jobs as if they were him. To many, the dinner felt like a repentance. To others, it felt like a purchase. Sarian continued to stitch. There is a work that insists even in the darkest rooms, the slow, patient return of needle through cloth. Her hands traveled familiar routes, picking out a seam, tightening a hem, while her mind traced other routes. What the town would be if it chose to protect, how it would look if it chose to accept the convenience of a factory over the dignity of a woman who said no. She was not untouched by gratitude offered in place of redress. She had repairs to make to her mother's roof and bills that would not wait for the machinery of justice. This was a tension that grounded everything. The urge to take what would ease poverty against the insistence that dignity not be traded for livelihood. In the weeks that followed the filing, Sam kept a ledger not of money, but of presence. He recorded who came to the school to offer testimony, who fed Sarian's mother while they waited for meetings, who stood guard outside the seamstress shop, and who fell silent when asked a direct question. He taught his students how to observe without weaponizing their eyes. He taught them how to hold memory as evidence rather than gossip. In the quiet of his evenings, he would place a hand on a table and think of stitches that held a hem in place. No one celebrated a seam that stayed together, but everyone noticed a hem undone. There were whispers that Maurice had begun to pressure the press of patronage that ran through town. Small grants rerouted, a tentative contract for a road repair that would favor suppliers he knew. Rosa watched with an old-fashioned, concentrated anger. She had no use for theatrical apologies. Leela began to keep a small ledger of her own. Names, dates, a dull, persistent tally of small favors that seemed suddenly implicated. The ledger was ordinary. Who had received a bag of rice? Who had a scholarship? Which school materials bore Maurice's logo? It looked like generosity until patterns appeared, and then it looked like an argument. Sam received a phone call one late night. Maurice was offering him a position, not money precisely, but influence within the new factory's proposed training program. It was framed as service to the town. Sam was a teacher, not a man for private deals. The offer felt like a test, a way to see if community values could be bought. In the small, private confrontation that followed, Sam told Maurice that he would not be available for any role that required silence about what had been seen. Maurice's smile thinned. "We're all for the town," Maurice said. "We must not let a single complaint rip the fabric." Sam answered simply, "The fabric is already torn." The meeting ended without thunder, but with a new knowledge that the price of silence would be counted soon. Word of the case spread beyond the Tamarind and the Square. Someone from a regional paper called with a voice that turned everything into a headline even as they spoke. Someone from a civic NGO asked for documentation. Mother and daughter worked their own rhythms, Rosa insisting that the shop keep running, Sarian returning the hem of a dress as if nothing had changed. Yet she began to teach nights, small classes on mending, so that the tiny economy of repair might be kept closer to home. To teach mending was to teach care, too. It was a way to make repair a skill rather than a sermon. There were nights Sarian returned to the burned edge of the blue scarf and let herself remember the exact way the fire had tasted. And in those hours she prepared for a publicness she had never wanted. To go before a town to tell truth is to make yourself a place people can aim at. Yet to hold silence was to live inside a debt. That made every choice a kind of seamstress's decision. To stitch, to tuck, to reveal the raw edge. As part one of the town's story gathers its loose threads, sides are being taken in small, precise ways. Contracts are being paused and considered. Public dinners continue with a carefulness that reveals as much as it conceals. And Sam continues to press for witnesses to be heard in official channels. Maurice continues to stand in rooms that smell of varnish and projectors, talking progress, while envelopes and dinners do the quiet work of persuasion. On an evening when the tamarind shadow fell long across the square, and the truck that had brought Maurice idled like a patient beast on the shoulder of the road, Sarian sat at her small table with a spool of blue thread pulled taut through the eye of a needle. She pressed the needle down and let the fabric yield. For all the bustle and the threats, the stitch was a faithful thing. One pass, another pass, a seam that gathered torn edges together. It was modest work, honest and slow. Outside, a lantern burned by the mayor's office. A generator hummed at the school. Inside, the needle drew the line between what was being repaired now and what would still be mended in time. If this moment feels like the crossroads you have seen in your own town, where money meets memory and the public square becomes a courtroom, then this is the part where your voice matters. If this touches something in you, leave a note for us below, starting with "I come from," and tell what your place would do when a promise arrives like a truck and a hand forgets to ask. The town waits now, stitched with provisional threads. There are hearings to come, affidavits that must be read aloud, and a stack of municipal minutes that will have to be pried open by patient hands. Maurice's promises outsized the town's needs and made new lines of debt. The mayor's office balanced the books between civic good and political survival. Sam's ledger filled with names. Officer Ellis kept his pen moving. Rosa mended in private with the blunt craft of a woman who knows how to keep a home upright. The scraped paint still raw on Sarian's door. A little circle of people had begun to take turns watching at night, hands on the windowsill, eyes on the road. The informal tribunals beneath the tamarind continued to mate. Sometimes they produced heat, sometimes just rumor. Leela's small ledger grew into a piece of evidence that someone would one day ask to see. Laya, who had always been able to summon the town's appetite, began to feed the watchers on nights when fear held longer than usual. And Sarian sold, because she could not avoid work, and because the act of making was the one thing that kept her present inside her own days. The seam that she sewed that night was a simple one, double-stitched where the fabric would endure the most. She pressed the seam with an iron the next morning, feeling the heat settle the thread into place. It was a small ritual of faith. Not that everything would be fully restored, but that some things could be made less raw. She understood the difference between a whole cloth and a mended patch. Both held their own kind of dignity. When the town meets next beneath the tamarind, when the affidavits are read and the sound of a bottle can break the polite air, what will be visible is not only the scandal of a single touch, but the larger architecture that allows a small town to be shaped by money and by mercy. This is where Sam will ask people to remember details, names, times, the way a hand moved, and where Maurice will make his most public appeals. It will be messy, it will be public, it will be real. Sarian finished the seam and ran her thumb along the thread. The needle hung like a metronome between her fingers, marking time. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and the room smelled of ink and lemon from her palms. When Leela began to read aloud, a name here, a date there, an amount matched to a face who later softened their testimony, the hush that followed was audible. The ledger showed patterns. Envelopes given to volunteers, school supplies bought in a man's initials, cash given to certain mothers the week before a crucial neighborhood vote. Maurice's smile faltered at the edges like a ribbon that had been knotted too tight. There was a compressed moment, brief, knife-sharp, when Sarian's mind recoiled to a single image. The burned blue scarf, folded small in the night. The way her mother had pressed it into a chest to hide it from neighbors. It lasted only a breath, an economy of pain, and then she breathed out and returned to the hall. The flash was not a story to tell there. It was the private seam that steadied her statement. This private flash is tight like a strand pulled taut. Smoke and a child's small shirt. A mother's fingers, soot dark, smoothing singed cotton. A quiet vow to be careful. The image hovered and then moved on. Sam's testimony was direct. He described times he had seen Maurice linger longer than was required outside the seamstress shop. The idling of a truck that stayed an extra hour in the wrong place. The way a man with power could make an offer feel like an expectation. He spoke in sensory details. The hum of engines, the clink of coins, the exact angle of a wrist when it was held too long. He did not moralize, he cataloged. His ledger, which he had kept in the folds of the schoolroom desk, came forward as a method of presence. Dates, names, short lines. Laya testified about the market's rhythms. She told of a man who could buy gratitude with generous plates, and of a moment when the crowd had turned from worry to calculation. Her voice rose in a register that did not accuse so much as record. Grandpa Harone nodded often, saying, "Oh, my child," to quiet the hall when it trembled, not as a dismissal, but as a lament. Maurice's defense unfolded along familiar lines: gratitude, investment, the need for jobs. He called his own witnesses, men from outside who could speak to the jobs he had created elsewhere, who described him as someone who gave chances. He leaned on the tangible, the pump installed, the chalk in the school, the new paint on the clinic. He spoke of philanthropy. When asked about the ledger, he called it gossip, a list of favors that could be interpreted many ways. Then Leela did something that made the room lurch toward reality. She had copies, photographs on a small stick, of images she had saved on an old phone, of receipts and a blurred image of a driver who had made a nightly drop. She asked them to be projected. The photograph of an envelope being passed under a table showed only hands, not faces. But the handwriting on a receipt matched the signature on a municipal requisition linked to Maurice's company. Someone gasped.
The moderator checked authenticity. Judge Alvarez ordered a pause to verify chain of custody. In the corridor outside, Maurice's men gathered like a defensive formation. Inside, the judge's gavel had the ordinary heft of a tool that could only mark a moment of process, not guarantee a moral end. Officer Ellis took a photocopy and logged it formally. The procedural clocks that had been read earlier began to tick in earnest. There was a short, precise statement of timelines. Filed documents logged, intake office expects review within 14 days. Notice must be sent within 30. Preliminary interviews scheduled within 45, extensions possible with cause, so that no one could later claim ignorance about the calendar. This sentence is a compact procedural note for the record. Complaint logged, intake 14 days, notice 30 days, interviews 45 days, extensions only with demonstrated cause. The afternoon pulled taut toward the festival night that Maurice had planned as a show of redemption. Banners already hung in the square, white lights strung like a promise. Maurice's aides said the festival would be a place for unity and to turn a page. Sam warned those who would listen that a page could also be a curtain. Leela, having seen the ledger's effect, was careful to carry a backup, a list of witnesses who had already said they would testify at the formal hearing. On the eve of the festival, a private confrontation occurred with the compressed force of a single blunt sentence. Maurice found Sam near the pump, pretending casual interest in the machinery while speaking with men who would be at his table later. He approached as if to make small talk, then slid into business. "You can be part of this. Help train, help steer," Maurice offered, his voice the honeyed currency he had used before. Sam's response was simple and exact. "I will not trade the truth for a title." Maurice's smile stopped short. The pump's water kept its measured noise. That exchange, brief, tight, a 500-600-character wound of intent, contained more than the words. It showed who believed in the currency of silence and who thought truth worth the cost. A compact scene, a bench, a pump's drip, two men whose futures were suggested by what they would accept. Festival night came with food and a band. The square glowed like a skillet. Maurice made his speech about jobs and futures, and the crowd's mood swayed like palm leaves. Yet the ledger's shadow lingered. Midway through the celebration, a young volunteer who had been on Maurice's payroll suddenly stood and declared he would speak the next day. It was little, just a voice, but it reminded the crowd that promises and envelopes could be unstitched. The hearing reconvened. Witnesses signed in one by one. Leela, hands now steady, produced another artifact, a ledger entry that matched a bank transfer. Maurice's aides muttered about coincidence and misremembered dates. The town's gossip, which had previously been a wind that could be scattered, now became testimony. A phone video surfaced, grainy but time-stamped, of a man placing an envelope in a cloth bag during a private meeting that the ledger had tied to a list of names. Officer Ellis admitted the video into the record after a brief consult with Judge Alvarez. That admission changed the tenor of what had been a contest of narratives into something more like a cartographic mapping of action. Maurice took the stand and answered questions with the practiced ease of someone used to being believed. He said he had meant to repair the town, that his envelopes were gestures, not bribes. He said he had offered apologies if anyone had been offended. He did not, however, confess to any attempt to silence testimony. His words were precise as a man who had been schooled in the art of partial truth. When asked if he would step back from the project pending review, he hesitated, ever the businessman calculating risk, and then offered a conditional agreement. He would pause certain public-facing contracts while the town decided the oversight mechanism. That conditional pause was not a confession, but it was not mere bravado either. The festival sponsors' banners remained, though some hands came down to fold them. Mayor Ortega found himself between two fires, the need for investment and the need for civic legitimacy. He proposed an oversight committee before the hearing closed, an advisory body with representatives from the market, the school, the elders, and an outside auditor. The suggestion was a political move, a way to share responsibility. The mayor's office would host the first meeting, the committee would publish minutes and a procurement register. It was an imperfect fix, but it was visible. The judge, noting the ledger and the video, issued an order that paused the largest contract linked to Maurice's company pending a financial audit and called for a formal review of procurement minutes connected to the project. A legal adjournment followed while the auditors were engaged. People left the hall with faces that had been rearranged by the afternoon's facts, some with relief, some with the sour taste of bargains interrupted. Maurice's public apology the next morning was careful. He spoke of intentions and missteps, of how generosity could be misread, and of his desire to rebuild with the town. He promised to fund a community garden and scholarships and to fund a mentorship program at the school. He would step away from formal leadership in the project and allow the committee to take the reins, he said, to let local voices steer. Rosa listened with a hand clenched in her apron. She measured the apology by the weight of the repair it offered, not the eloquence of the words. The Oversight Committee convened in the mayor's small office the following week. It was a cross-section of the town, Sam for the school, Laya and Leela for market workers, Grandpa Heron, who brought an elder's gaze, Mira and Rosa for neighborhood voices, Officer Ellis as the municipal liaison. Judge Alvarez recommended an independent auditor, and the town voted for transparency. Procurement minutes would be publicly posted, the committee would vet any philanthropic offers over a set monetary threshold, and donations to the school would be entered into a public ledger. Where the ledger had once been its maker's hidden map, the town now sought to make every line visible. Maurice agreed, reluctantly at times and more willingly at others, to release certain records. He signed a memorandum that pledged partial reparations, the garden seed money, 5 scholarships for trade training, a small fund for emergency repairs to the most vulnerable roofs. It was not everything Sarian might have wanted. It was not even all that people had expected. But it was work structured into the public ledger. Not a hush payment, but a stated investment through the committee. There were consequences beyond the mayor's office. 2 contractors who had depended on Maurice's favor lost their interim agreement when the audit highlighted irregularities. Those gaps in contracts were not a moral victory so much as a rearrangement of livelihoods. The regional NGO agreed to oversee the mentorship program to ensure the town held to promised transparency. Officer Ellis briefed people on next steps for the formal investigation, reminding them that administrative pauses were not convictions, nor were they absolutions. They were breathing space. In the weeks after, Sarian returned to the work that always steadied her: mending, teaching, making. She opened a small evening circle for neighbors, a mending workshop where the price was a story and an afternoon of help around the roof. The workshop was slow to fill. Trust had been frayed. But bit by bit, seats occupied. One woman learned to stitch a hem without puckers. A young man who had idled near Maurice's truck took the classes and then asked to apprentice formally, not thanks to Maurice, but because the committee's mentorship program had opened an application.
Small contracts came. A nearby hostel needed curtains. A literacy class needed patched book covers. Work that paid without the sting of expectation in the small of the back. At 1 month, Sarian's class had a waiting list. Laya reported that market disputes had lessened as the committee's minutes went online, and the town grew used to seeing where money moved. The pump outside the square worked with a new maintenance schedule drawn by the committee. The gardener at the kindergarten received seeds paid out from the garden fund Maurice had set aside. Not everything ran smoothly. A few who had once benefited quietly from envelopes complained of lost income. There were quiet fights on porches.
Rosa won a small grant for a repaired roof, but the grant did not erase the years of bills. At 3 months, the Oversight Portal published its first set of procurement minutes and receipts. Small auditors from the regional NGO walked several of the town's streets, met with suppliers, and issued a short public report that recommended continued oversight and suggested procurement rules. Multiple bids for contracts over a modest threshold, public posting of winter maims, a cooling-off period before private sponsors could provide direct cash to volunteer organizations. These were structural changes, procedural guardrails designed to make opaque influence harder to hide. Some villagers cheered. Others muttered that rules would not stitch a burned edge. The committee, now meeting weekly, kept minutes and posted them on a simple page the school maintained. At 6 months, the community garden had produced tomatoes and a small row of beans. Children who had once been absent from school in high numbers began coming back, their shirts patched and bright because a mentorship stipend helped their families tide over a difficult month. Sam's class had new books donated through a transparent application process. The mentorship program enrolled 12 young people who were not connected to Maurice's networks. Maurice attended one committee meeting in person that spring. He sat at the back and offered material donations, seed packets, sewing machines for Sarian's class, but he did not stand at the podium. The town accepted the machines into the workshop and insisted that the terms be written into the committee's ledger. The repairs were real and partial. They did not erase the memory of a single touch in the market that had unstitched the town's comfort. They did not guarantee a final reconciliation, nor did they erase the ledger stains. But the garden grew. The school's attendance improved in small increments. Sarian's mending class had birthed a micro-enterprise collective that bid on local contracts in an open process. People began to show up for committee meetings, learning how an ordinary voice could record and then recall. They learned how to make witnesses matter. There remained fractures. Some in town still bought silence with favors. Some who had backed Maurice felt economically squeezed by the pause. There were whispers. Old economies do not die quickly. The formal investigation that Officer Ellis had promised continued in the background. Enough evidence had been gathered that professional auditors recommended further review of the tendering process. Not a criminal verdict to read as a public catharsis, but a prying open of processes that had long been bound in habit rather than law. The town moved slowly, not because it had forgotten, but because repair is slow. Sarian's relationship with forgiveness took its own shape. She did not announce absolution. In a small public moment at the garden's ribbon cutting, paper scissors, and awkward applause, she accepted the community's seed money as a resource for young gardeners, not as a symbol of closure. When Maurice approached and offered words that sounded like apology, she listened with a seamstress's attention, measuring what he said against what she saw him do afterward. She allowed herself to be civil. She allowed herself to be cautious. Forgiveness, she found, was less a gift you gave another than a practice you cultivated for yourself. Small acts of letting go that did not mean forgetting. Sam kept teaching, but his ledger had changed. He taught civic literacy now, how to keep a record, how to take a witness statement that mattered, how to preserve a chain of events. The school bulletin included a short note on where to find the committee's minutes and how to file a procurement concern. Laya and Leela rotated duties on the oversight committee. Leela's quiet ledger had become an instrument of accountability rather than a secret weapon.
Grandpa Heron kept attending meetings, saying, "Oh, my child," into the microphone with a gravity that made everyone chuckle. The phrase had softened into an expression of communal care rather than only comfort. Maurice, in the months after, altered his public posture. He no longer led the bannered dinners. He began to sponsor smaller acts administered through the committee. Seed packets, classroom supplies, a modest scholarship fund with an application and transparent award criteria. The town tested his investments against the records. When inconsistencies appeared, an invoice without bids, a supplier repeatedly favored, the committee flagged them and the auditors required clarification. Maurice complied grudgingly at first and then with more attention, as if learning a new vocabulary: accountability. The external adjudicator who had helped the town set procurement rules issued a short public notice. The project's big contract would remain paused until the audit concluded. Meanwhile, the committee's oversight measures should remain. They recommended a longer-term review of municipal procurement practices, and the mayor agreed to a modest series of workshops on transparent budgeting. These were not cures. They were, at best, a new set of stitches to hold torn community practices in place as a stronger fabric was slowly woven. In private moments, Sarian continued to stitch. Her hands moved with the same patient fidelity as ever. She taught a young woman how to finish a collar. She mended a neighbor's child's shirt and took extra care at the same. The microphone of public proof had shifted into the small rooms of ordinary labor. The mending collective that grew from her classes secured small local contracts through the open procurement portal. They earned fair payment for work that had always been worth it, but that had not always been given at fair value.
Months later, in a quiet afternoon, Sarian sat by the tamarind tree and sewed a tiny patch into a child's jumper. The tamarind leaves sounded like a distant radio, a frictional hum of days. She ran a finger along the new stitch. It held. It would require care to last, washing in hot sun, mending if the thread frayed, but it held. She thought of the burned blue scarf folded away at the back of a drawer. She let its memory be what it was, part of herself, not the whole of her life. On the day the committee published its first 6-month report, the town gathered again beneath the tamarind. The report did not claim victory. It listed adjustments, irregularities revealed, funds allocated, the names of those who had benefited from scholarships, the minutes of meetings, and the auditor's recommendations. It showed that influence had been powerful but not invincible. Citizens read the list aloud in parts. Some people cried, others clapped, and a few muttered about the slowness of all things municipal. The act of publishing was itself a stitch in the civic fabric. Sarian stood at the edge of the crowd and felt both the rawness and the slow repair. She had not sought notoriety. The title that people abroad might give, the shocking love triangle, felt absurd in the small of her household room, where a child refused to let go of a patched doll. The triangle, Maurice with his truck and money, Sam with his ledger and steady presence, and Sarian with her thread and history, had reshaped the town's conversation about power and consent. In the end, it was not just scandal that had been revealed. It was a set of choices about how a town could protect its own. There was no tidy ending. Maurice had stepped back from leadership roles and funded partial repairs, and the committee had begun its slow work of publishing records and vetting donors. Some community members felt vindicated. Others felt the bitterness of a loss they could not name. The formal processes chugged forward, audits, reviews, and the possibility of further legal steps. But the town's daily repair work also continued: workshops, committees, seedlings, mending circles. In the final quiet that evening, Sarian returned to her table with a length of cloth, a spool of thread, and a single lamp. Her fingers passed the needle and the fabric shifted under her hand. She pressed the seam flat with the iron, not to promise that all the town's wounds would close, nor to say that every wrong had been made right, but to acknowledge that some things could be mended with care, honesty, and persistent hands. She lifted the cloth and ran her thumb along the new seam. The stitch held, small and governed by the discipline of practice. She thought of forgiveness not as a one-time act,
but as a slow habit, to set boundaries, to insist on transparency, to teach others how to stitch their lives with attention. She kept the burned blue scarf closed in the drawer, a reminder of caution and of what had been survived. Outside, down the lane, the truck that had once idled like thunder sat quieter than before. Maurice's name was still on people's lips. His choices still shadowed decisions. But the town had taken a step toward a different future. Less convenient in some ways, the repair slower and more laborious, but more collective. People had learned, painfully, that money could buy many small silences, yet could not unmake a recorded ledger or a witness who decided to speak. Sarian threaded the needle one more time and made a tidy knot. She set the hem with the practiced care of someone who understood that sewing was not magic but method. She stitched a line that would need reworking in time, and she folded the cloth gently, touching the seam as if to bless it with the small, steady faith of a worker whose trade was also a covenant. If you want more stories about how communities wrestle with power, consent, and repair, if you want to follow how these seams hold and where they fray, subscribe and follow our series.